All right. So, hi everyone. My name is Signe Lynch. I know there are some familiar faces and names in the Zoom call today, and thank you for taking some time on this busy school week and or back to school week. But my name is Signe Lynch. I am the McKinney-Vento homeless education specialist at the Maine Department of Education. And my role is the state coordinator of homeless education under the federal McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And here is the Maine Department of Education's mission, and we're really promoting the best learning opportunities for all Maine students by providing information, guidance, and support to our schools, educators, and leaders, and by providing adequate and equitable school funding and resources. And here's the current department strategic goals, but really where I see McKinney-Vento fitting into a lot of the work that is done in our school systems is that equity for all Maine learners. So our goal is really to ensure that students experiencing housing instability are able to get to school every day, regardless of those housing circumstances that may present as a barrier. So I know that a lot of folks here are serving in the role as McKinney-Vento liaison for their school communities or are supporting directly that work. And today we're just going to be covering all of the student situations that may qualify for McKinney-Vento in our school systems and talking a little bit about some of the policies and procedures that are in place, the statute, as well as some of the statutory roles of the McKinney-Vento liaison in a school system. And like I had mentioned at the start, I am just managing the chat and the waiting room at the same time. So if there is a question in the chat that I haven't addressed, please feel free to just raise your hand or come off mic, and I'm happy to address that question in the moment as well. It's helpful to know too, if you don't mind putting in the chat, just who what people's familiarity is with the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act in their current role. And one being, I've never heard of this. It's my first time taking on this role or doing this work in our school system. And I just want all of the overview. 5 being, I've been doing this for a really long time. I know McKinney-Vento super well. I could be giving this presentation. It's just helpful for me to understand just where people are at. Awesome. All right. So seeing some people that are familiar, I know we have some seasoned liaisons in the room, and it's just helpful to know that we're just covering today the basics of McKinney-Vento as well as some of that statutory pieces for the role of McKinney-Vento liaison too. So for context, McKinney-Vento is federal legislation. It's part of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, and it was really this first major federal legislative response to homelessness across the country. So it was first passed in 1987. We've had several amendments along the way, the most recent being in 2015 as part of Every Student Succeeds Act. And the main piece of McKinney-Vento when it relates to education is that we're removing those barriers to students facing housing instability. Something really important to note when we talk about homelessness in education and talk about homelessness across the board, across various agencies, is that we don't have federal or state alignment on the definition of homelessness. So these slides are going to be shared with everyone that registered for this so that you'll have this for reference as well. But something to be aware of is that we don't have that federal alignment on the definition of homelessness. But something to just keep in mind as the McKinney-Vento liaison is that when we talk about homelessness in education, we're using the most inclusive definition of homelessness that's utilized across federal agencies and state agencies. So we're really looking at capturing all the different forms of housing instability that a student might find themselves in that could present as that barrier to education. And it's just helpful to keep that in mind, particularly if you're making referrals or working with a local housing agency, and they might be coming back to you and saying, oh, this family might not be eligible right now because of that misalignment in those homeless definitions. When we talk about homelessness and education, we are using the definition of students who are lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And these protections apply to all public school students that are preschool, so a publicly funded preschool program through grade 12, who lack that fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And a really easy way to frame this when you're looking at potential eligibility is really, can that student go to the same place every night, and is that place safe and sufficient? So that's that fixed, regular, and adequate. And if it's missing one of those key elements of what we're looking for in housing and stability, that's when we're going to want to ask some follow-up questions about, is the student maybe eligible and considered a McKinney-Vento student? Building out that definition more, and if you've been in our Maine DOE presentations before related to McKinney-Vento, we talk about students that might be living in a camper, so a campground or a camper in someone's yard. This is a common occurrence across Maine and other states as well. There's nowhere else for that family to stay, so they might be seasonally living in a campground or staying in a camper in someone's backyard. Students that are staying in a hotel or motel, these aren't our students that are on family vacation. These are our families that have nowhere else to go, and they're temporarily staying in a hotel motel, whether it's through their own funding resources or maybe another funding resource that's helping them stay in that hotel or motel temporarily. Couch surfing, falls into the larger category that we would call doubled up. And that means sharing housing due to a loss of housing. It could be economic hardship or a similar reason. And couch surfing falls into this doubled up category, which is by far the most common situation that students will find themselves in Maine and across the country, that sharing housing due to a loss of housing. Any student that's staying in a shelter or a transitional living program that's operated by a homeless provider, that can include some of what we'll talk about with our unaccompanied homeless youth. We have homeless youth provider groups across the state. Some of those hubs would be Preble Street down in southern Maine, New Beginnings in central Maine. We also have the Shaw House operated by Community Care in Bangor, the Northern Lighthouse, and then some opportunities in Midcoast. Those programs might be able to have a student stay with them in a transitional living program for a year, 18 months, 2 years, the entire time a student is in housing that's provided through one of those homeless provider groups. That would also qualify them. Any student that would be staying in a car. This is actually a photo from Washington County in Maine, and it's referencing migrant education program students. So migratory students that are traveling with their families for seasonal agricultural work or fishery work. So that's actually quite prominent in Maine with blueberry harvest, as well as some of our fishery work and potato season. So that's something to keep in mind. And that migrant education program students don't automatically qualify for McKinney-Vento, but they often are going to qualify because they're moving into these temporary housing situations. And oftentimes the employer's temporary housing situations, we would not consider to be adequate for the young people living in that. Substandard housing is another really big piece of McKinney-Vento. And it's really could be a lot of different things. So these are where we see families identified because they lack a vital utility. So considering the springtime particularly, we see a lot of families that may not have been able to keep up with their electrical bills over the duration of the winter, particularly those homes that might have that electric baseboard heating, and they rack up these really, really big bills of electricity. And come the springtime, they might have that notice of shut off and not be able to pay that bill that was accrued over the winter months. The same could be said for like winter heating programs. So unsafe ways of heating the home or lacking the ability to fill the oil tank or have wood or pellets for the stove. Those are examples of what could be substandard housing. Other things are vermin in the home that may be making children sick or might be unsafe, not up to local building codes. Those are all considerations when thinking about students that are in substandard housing. Overcrowding also falls into that larger category of doubled up. And doubled up can look like a lot of different things, but overcrowding could be certainly a situation where we have multiple students staying in one bed, a whole family staying in one bedroom, and that space is not adequate. And then this would just be that example of running out of heat, which is something that we see in Maine and certainly creates unsafe living situations for students. Here's the definitions lined up, and just something to be aware of too. As the McKinney-Vento liaison, one of the other pieces that's explicit is the abandoned in hospitals. Those are really challenging cases. So if you did have a case where a student was abandoned in a hospital, meaning that their legal guardian is refusing to pick them up, and this is something that actually has been in the news in Maine, those are cases that you would certainly feel free to loop me into, because that would be a cross-agency response. But those students, when the guardian refuses to pick them up, would pick up that McKinney-Vento identification too. Here's just a little information on the Migrant Education Program, which is another federal program that exists. And it's just lining out that many of those families that fill out that Migrant Education Program form in school enrollment packets are likely something that a family that we would want to follow up with about potential McKinney-Vento eligibility as well. Doubled up, most common situation that families are in. And here's just some tools for thinking about identification of these doubled up families. So not all doubled up situations are always going to be McKinney-Vento, but oftentimes we are going to see doubled up families, especially during that initial move into, for example, a relative's house or a family friend's home, picking up that identification of McKinney-Vento. And then we really think about what is fixed, regular, and adequate. And is that housing situation stationary, permanent, not subject to change? Is the place used on a predictable, routine, and consistent basis, considering the relative permanence? And then that adequate, is it lawfully and reasonably sufficient for meeting the physical and psychological needs typically met in home environments? And one of the questions we ask families that are in these potential doubled up situations or explicit doubled up situations are, do they have a legal right to be where they are? So if they were asked to leave that home, if there was a conflict with the current lease holder or the person who owns the home, could that person just say, hey, you know what, this isn't working out and we need you out by tomorrow? So just thinking about, is there any legal recourse for that person being asked to leave too? And these are always case-by-case situations, but we really look at that doubled up situation due to a loss of housing related to economic hardship or similar reasons. Similar reasons could be things like a natural disaster makes the home that the family was in unable to be lived in for a time being. Fires, house fires are something that we see actually quite a bit for McKinney-Vento identification when families become doubled up. And also domestic violence, so where there might be a family that is fleeing an alleged abuser and moving into another home because that home was no longer safe to them. Any questions about the broad eligibility determinations and potential students that could pick up McKinney-Vento? Okay, I just want to make sure I'm answering questions as they come up. So I also want to make sure we're covering unaccompanied homeless youth. So this is a specific demographic within our McKinney-Vento student population. And this really means our students that are McKinney-Vento eligible, they're in a nighttime residence that's not fixed, regular, and adequate. And they're experiencing that not in the physical custody of their legal guardian. There are times where cases like this, and we have this very helpful flow chart that's actually from the National Center for Homeless Education that helps with McKinney-Vento liaisons being able to make this identification of, is this an unaccompanied youth or is this an unaccompanied homeless youth? And we really think about, was it their family conflict? So unaccompanied homeless youth could be family conflict cases where you have potentially a runaway youth that might be in the middle school, high school age, or that family legal guardian has asked that young person that's a minor to leave the home, and they would potentially be picking up that unaccompanied homeless youth identification. We also see situations where maybe the parent or guardian is very involved with the student, but they're not, they might be collectively as a family be experiencing homelessness, and the parents themselves might be staying in a different situation, but another relative is able to take in that youth for the time being. And that's where we also will see potential unaccompanied homeless youth identification. And just something to keep in mind is that there's no lower age limit for unaccompanied homeless youth. And we do have elementary school students that are considered unaccompanied homeless youth in our school systems, just like we have those unaccompanied homeless youth in middle school and high school. An important piece for the unaccompanied homeless youth and the role of liaison is, so we really think about, there's the McKinney-Vento eligibility, and that is determined. And then if they're not in the physical custody of a legal guardian, then we would identify them as that unaccompanied homeless youth. For those cases, we have like a caregiver form. So if it is like a younger student that's staying with another relative that's acting as a parent for the time being, we have a caregiver form to help communicate with the school about basic school needs. And then for our students that are unaccompanied homeless youth and also receiving special education services where the legal guardian cannot be contacted, that's where we would assign what we would call a special education surrogate parent. And that is assigned through the Office of Special Services, and it's something that you would work with your special education director on. And some of our McKinney-Vento liaisons are the special education director or work on the special education administrative team. And there's a specific form that is filled out to make that assignment, and it is sent to the Office of Special Services and to Sarah Ferguson specifically to make that formal assignment to help with those IEP decisions. And that's in the absence of a legal guardian for specifically the unaccompanied homeless youth demographic. And specifically in the state of Maine, unaccompanied homeless youth, and so this is not part of the federal McKinney-Vento statute, but other states, and Maine is one of them, have adopted that minors that are identified as an unaccompanied homeless youth can give consent to medical, mental, dental, and other health counseling services if they're living separately from those parents. And that's something to keep in mind because it's explicit that the McKinney-Vento liaison is the one that can make that identification and complete that form for a provider. And so we do see a lot of our liaisons filling out, we have a sample form that can be used, and certainly your SAU or school community can make your own formal form, but we have a sample form that can be used to make that determination and sent to a provider. Just saying that, hey, we've identified the student as an unaccompanied homeless youth, and sending that and faxing it to a provider. When we talk about homelessness, and you'll hear me say McKinney-Vento a lot, there's so much stigma around the word homeless, and historically this has really been branded the homeless program within schools. And for many of our families that are experiencing situations that would be considered homeless under education's definition, there's so much stigma about just like what that word is and what it means about a family or an individual. But we've really done a lot of work about changing the narrative, and you'll hear me say the McKinney-Vento students McKinney-Vento program, to just try and make sure that that's language that students and families understand that it is designed to be it's a federal law that's designed to protect students' rights to be able to go to school despite instability that might be going on, and just reflecting on our own vulnerabilities to potentially experiencing homelessness, that we're all in a vulnerable position to potentially have our home burned down, for things that are outside of our control. Um, and just keeping these things in mind, particularly as we provide information on McKinney-Vento and qualifying situations to school staff and families that are coming into school. And Maine is ninth in the nation for rates of homelessness by population. So this really is happening in communities across our state. And when we look at research that looks at homelessness across various communities, we see time and time again that rural homelessness and urban homelessness occur at similar rates. They just can look very different. And something I always like to highlight with our McKinney-Vento liaisons is just how important education is for the this young student population. And when we look at adult homelessness and breaking cycles of homelessness, the highest risk factor for experiencing adult homelessness is that lack of a high school diploma or high set GED. So just something to keep in mind, that we really want students to be successful in their education and have those opportunities. This is just some of the information from the Maine Department of Education data dashboard. And it's just looking at the student population across all students in Maine, and then looking at some of the graduation rates that we see for homeless students. So we know that our homeless students do struggle in schools, and the importance of McKinney-Vento to provide some of those supports. A lot of it is related to attendance, right? So our demographic that in our Maine data that struggles the most and has the most challenges with chronic absenteeism is our student population that is identified as McKinney-Vento. And then when we talk about chronic absenteeism, this is from the 23-24 school year. That's really the percentage of students enrolled in elementary and secondary education for at least 10 days and have missed 10% or more of those days enrolled. So that's quite a bit of our almost half of our homeless students are experiencing chronic absenteeism. And from data, the Maine McKinney-Vento students, we've seen a dramatic rise in our identification. And for those that have been in this position for a few years, they might be aware that, during that pandemic year and after it, we had the American Rescue Plan, which had very specific dedicated funding to supporting the McKinney-Vento program and connecting homeless children and youth to resources. So when we see this dramatic rise that started in the 21-22 school year, I think that we can really attribute that to there was increased resources that were unprecedented for dedicated funding to this student population. And there was also a lot of hardship that families were going through and continue to go through, just related to affordable housing, basic needs just costing a lot more. And I know through conversations that we are seeing a lot of just these families that are in really dire situations, just because affordable housing is really hard to come by in Maine. And people are struggling the wages that people are making are not necessarily keeping up with the cost of living that people are trying to navigate right now. And this is our student demographic breakdown of who was identified as McKinney-Vento. So when we report on student data in your student information system, it'll ask for residency, and then it'll ask for homeless status. And then once that homeless status is selected, it's gonna ask what type of nighttime residence they're in. So this is what the US Department of Education asked the Maine Department of Education, and us in turn are asking local school systems to report out on. And this is our 4 categories. So double WLC is the most common situation. And then we have those students that are staying in shelters, hotels and hotel and motels, and then unsheltered. Unsheltered is also taking in, our students that are in substandard housing. So those students that might be staying in a campground, or they're staying in a camper in someone's backyard, or sleeping in a car. Those are the types of situations that get coded into that unsheltered category. And also just keeping in mind that McKinney-Vento students also have different identifications coming up as well. So we see overlap in terms of a lot of our McKinney-Vento students are also receiving special education services, and that we do have a good percentage of our total McKinney-Vento students that are identified by their school system as experiencing that situation as an unaccompanied homeless youth. So around 15% of that student population is unaccompanied as well. And just speaking to, talking about how we speak to McKinney-Vento and homelessness in schools, and that we've really tried to reframe and say McKinney-Vento, McKinney-Vento, rather than, oh, you are a homeless student, and just thinking and being aware of that language. Any questions about anything thus far? I want to make sure, I know I'm talking a lot, so I just want to make sure that anyone that has any questions has those addressed. All right, I'm going to keep plugging along. So for McKinney-Vento, when you are looking at all the resources that are online related to McKinney-Vento, whether it's state statute, federal statute, non-regulatory guidance, there's so many acronyms that come up, but just something to be aware of. Very common ones that we see are just that MV, McKinney-Vento. We see BID a lot, and that references what we would call a best interest determination that I'll talk about shortly. POCs are typically what we would say are point of contact. So if you have a school system that's larger and you have maybe your Maine McKinney-Vento liaison that's designated, you might choose to have point of contacts at each specific school to help with identification and awareness, staff awareness as well. CBOs, that's our community-based organizations, and we try to connect as much as possible with our community providers around us to make referrals and make sure that families have what they need, and knowing that it's not just all on the school system to come up with solutions for the hardships that some families and individual students are going through. EHCY, this comes up a lot. So if you spend time online trying to find answers for McKinney-Vento, it's going to be a lot related to the Education of Homeless Children and Youth program. And that is the reference to the federal statute under McKinney-Vento. And again, when you look at some of the national guidance, it'll probably say CYEH, and that's just children and youth experiencing homelessness. As we reference federal statute, you're going to see that LEA and SEA. LEA is just that local education agency, and what we mean by that is your school administrative unit that you're in, and SEA being the state education agency, being the Maine Department of Education. So laws and regulation. So we have that federal McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And again, these slides will be available and they are linked, so you can always go right to the statute for reference. And within the state rules of education, we've taken that federal statute that all of us have to adhere to from the LEA and the SEA perspective. And then we have Chapter 14, which is the Education of Homeless Students. So those are the rules that govern the Department of Education and the State Board of Education, and they help sort of articulate some of that federal statute and make some of the clearer definitions that apply at the state level. So we talk about those SAUs of origin and SAU of residence, and talking about some of the local and state dispute procedures that are required by that federal statute. There's also non-regulatory guidance that's available by the U.S. Department of Education. And the last time that was published and updated was in 2016. The implementation of McKinney-Vento, we really have that U.S. Department of Education that has very few staff that work on McKinney-Vento. But they do contract out with the National Center for Homeless Education. So that's our national TA center that myself or any of you could contact if you had a specific question. So if there's a really tricky case that maybe one of your teams is working on that the Maine Department of Education doesn't have an immediate answer for, we might consult with the National Center for Homeless Education for some guidance and support to be able to support at the local level. And they're providing technical assistance. And oftentimes when people are reaching out to me specifically for guidance, I'm going to reference briefs that are approved by the U.S. Department of Education as guidance for McKinney-Vento. So their website is always available. They have a series of briefs. And for example, that rarely commonly used unaccompanied homeless youth flow chart, that's something that's published by the National Center for Homeless Education. And as of right now, there's always questions about that federal side. Our McKinney-Vento team at the U.S. Department of Education and this National Center for Homeless Education, our TA center, is available, and everyone continues to support this program, and these two programs are intact. So then we work from the SEA perspective, and that's where we have the state coordinator, which is the role that I serve. I help with some of the technical assistance that you're working with on the ground, and pre-dispute mediations and looking at formal disputes that come through, and having the opportunity to provide some of these training opportunities as well, newsletters, information getting out to schools, and making sure that people have data as well to look at. At the local level, that's really where eligibility is determined. So if you're the McKinney-Vento liaison under the federal statute, it's your decision to make these eligibility calls, and based on the case-by-case situation that you're looking at, and that you've gathered information from your school staff that might know the student or family best. So that eligibility is ultimately determined at the local level, because at the state level, we would be looking at formal disputes that come through. I am always happy to provide, that technical assistance piece and have some of those conversations and guiding questions that can come out. But that local liaison is the one that's making those eligibility decisions and removing some of those barriers. Every SAU has to have, or every local education agency and SAU has to have that McKinney-Vento liaison available and designated. So this is done through NEO, through your school administrative team, and they would be making that and documenting it to the Maine Department of Education. And we do have this very handy McKinney-Vento contact lookup. It's getting updated right now with all of the new changes that came through NEO for the start of the school year. So if you haven't seen maybe your new contact information or your name pop up yet, but it's in NEO, we're running that update. It doesn't transfer immediately over. We have to put it into a different spreadsheet so that we can make sure that each town is reflected in it. But those updates are occurring, so they should be done soon. So this is a really helpful tool that you can just select the town that a student may be living in and residing in, and it will tell you exactly who the McKinney-Vento liaison is and the contact information for them. You'll also see that there's the charter school liaisons, because charter schools are receiving those public dollars. They need to follow this federal statute. And then we have higher ed liaisons. And the higher ed liaisons, I'll talk about in a second, just for reference. But like I said about the federal statute, those protections really apply to public preschool through grade 12. But we try to support a full spectrum of learners too. As the liaison has a lot of responsibilities in this statute. And I know that for Maine and many of our smaller states, the liaison is wearing a lot of different hats in their school community. And so it's really important for the broader school staff to be really aware of what McKinney-Vento is, the students that qualify, and the rights and services that they're eligible for. So it's really making sure that your child nutrition team, school social workers, data managers, because we want to make sure that this data is accurate. It can impact funding. It's helpful for us to be able to reflect on at a state level as well. School nurses too, particularly for our unaccompanied homeless youth, and making those external referrals as needed. Transportation is a really big piece of it. And Title I. So Title I, when we talk a little bit about funding, that does come into play too, of making sure that the school is setting aside appropriate funds to support this specific student demographic. But making sure that you're not alone and isolated in this work, and that it really is a team effort. And for supports, you can always reach out to the Maine Department of Education. I'm in the Office of School and Student Support. We also have that National Center for Homeless Education and their hotline that's available to everyone. And then you have the McKinney-Vento liaisons around you. And then we have early education and higher education. And early education, we have, so this is specifically if you were working with a family and you start discussing with them about potentially what's going on, and you learn that there is a younger kiddo in that housing situation, and they're not going to any services specifically yet for early childhood. So you could certainly make a referral to our points of contacts at Child Development Services. That would be Jackie Hersom and Brooke Smith, and their contacts information is here. And they can help get those young kiddos connected to support. So really looking at that referral to Child Development Services. And if that referral is coming from Jackie or Brooke, then they might reach out to you. But really, they're going to look at the different eligible services that a younger child that might not be yet attending your school system is potentially eligible. And that could be Head Start or Early Head Start, because those students are categorically eligible. So if they're McKinney-Vento, they might be able to get priority spots, and that they are eligible for Head Start. They might be receiving additional services from CDS, Child Care Affordability Program, and Child Development Services could potentially help with those other referrals. And this is actually one of the statutory duties of the McKinney-Vento liaison, is providing those referrals and making sure that those younger kiddos are eligible and referred out to those programs. And a lot of this is related to an expansion that occurred in 2015 as part of Every Student Succeeds Act, expanding the definition of school of origin to include that preschool. Preschool really is the programs that are funded by the SAU. So special education services are funded by the LEA or mandated under the Individuals with Disabilities Act. Here's just how the U.S. Department of Education would define what that preschool program would look like. And then these are the federal requirements that you can review as well. And then on the higher education side of things, we have a Maine specific statute that went into place in 2020, where we have designated liaisons at the Maine Community College System, as well as the UMaine System schools and Maine Maritime. And this is helpful for our students that are making that transition, that were identified as McKinney-Vento throughout their high school career or in their senior year, and they are looking for those higher education opportunities. The liaison would help make that connection with the Maine college that they're hoping to attend, and make sure that they have that warm handoff and can potentially get some priority for housing, maybe assistance navigating what housing will look like during those school breaks at the higher education institution. And one of the statutory pieces of a liaison is the independent student status for the FAFSA. So the McKinney-Vento liaison is making an independent student status determination for unaccompanied homeless youth that are pursuing higher education. And so that's something that is sent directly to the college that they're applying to. And there are a lot of sample forms that we have to help make that determination. Any questions about those higher education early childhood pieces? All right. Clarification for McKinney-Vento liaisons, and this question comes up quite a bit, is students in foster care. And what that really means is if the Department of Health and Human Services has taken a minor into their custody through child welfare services, uh, they are what we would call a foster care student, and they would not typically qualify as a McKinney-Vento student, even in those situations where we do have a lack of available foster homes for the students that are in the child welfare system. So sometimes we are seeing students that are in the custody of child welfare being placed temporarily in a hotel or motel with caseworkers, or potentially at a youth shelter for the time being, as DHHS is working towards another placement. In all of those other situations, we would typically identify a student automatically as McKinney-Vento, but we want to know if they're in the custody of DHHS, because if that is the case, then they would be those foster care students. And they have very similar rights and provisions as our McKinney-Vento students, but we wouldn't see, for example, a student that is staying in a hotel or motel with a caseworker would not be considered what we would call an unaccompanied homeless youth. They're a foster care student. And this was clarified as part of the Every Student Succeeds Act, where awaiting foster care was removed from McKinney-Vento, and the foster care provisions were bolstered to just provide more clarity. But they do have the right to transportation and maintaining stability in the school of origin. There is a foster care point of contact, just like there is a McKinney-Vento liaison in every single LEA. And there might be some of our McKinney-Vento liaisons here that are also serving as the foster care. If you want to throw in the chat, if you are also the foster care point of contact, please feel free to do so, because I know that is a cap that is worn by some of our, both our liaisons and who are also serving as foster care. We have a foster care point of contact at the Maine DOE that is also available for questions related to this and works with DHHS on these cases. So just something to keep in mind. That would be Aubrey Howard. And we're actually going to be hosting office hours together this year on the first Thursday of every month, with some professional development built in. So please stay tuned for the registration for that, which I'll send out as a follow-up to this, but something that will be available so that people who have questions and want some more professional development on that will be built in each month. And for those McKinney-Vento and foster care students, just remembering that they do all have best interest determination rights. So that's really about if they can continue at that school of origin, so the school that they were last at when they were, or they were last regularly attending, or where they were last permanently residing, and then transportation to the school of origin if it's in their best interest. If it's in the best interest for them to enroll in the school of residence, that would be an immediate enrollment, just like McKinney-Vento students, and then some of those support services. The thing that differs from McKinney-Vento and foster care is that in that best interest determination process, instead of what we would say the school of origin having final authority on a best interest determination, DHHS has that final authority. But it really is a collaborative effort with the school team, the foster care point of contact at the school, DHHS, and the other school communities that may be involved to make that best interest determination. The only times that we see that double identification for foster care in McKinney-Vento is when a student is McKinney-Vento at the start of the school year, and maybe that was a really unsafe situation, and child welfare does come in and take custody of that student. And those are where we see McKinney-Vento students being eligible for McKinney-Vento and then picking up foster care status because DHHS has come in and take custody of them. And that's because McKinney-Vento eligibility applies the full school year until June 30th each year. And these are the office hours that we'll be hosting, myself with Aubrey, who's the foster care point of contact, to be able to answer some of those more specific and niche questions that come up in our school communities. Funding for McKinney-Vento. So just to overview, federally, we don't receive a lot of specific federal dollars for McKinney-Vento. The federal dollars that we receive each year go out in a competitive request for applications, and we do them in a 3-year cycle. So we're currently in year 2 of a 3-year subgrant that 8 SAUs receive to specifically support McKinney-Vento programming within their schools. So we would have another RFA in a couple of years to be able to open that up again. The other federal funding that goes specifically to McKinney-Vento is that Title I Part A. So every Title I school has to have a homeless set aside as part of that Title I Part A. And that's something to always just make sure that you're aware of how much money is set aside for McKinney-Vento specifically. And on the state side, we have Preventing Student Homelessness. So this is the program that has been in place for the past couple of years that was initiated by the Maine legislature as a pilot program. And so for the past 2 school years, we had $1.5 million and then $1.5 million that was distributed to all SAUs in the state of Maine. And it was based on the number of McKinney-Vento students identified in the student information system. And it allows schools to have access to emergency funding. It was based on it was rooted in prevention, but it had 4 allowable categories of use. And those categories of use were rental assistance or short-term hotel motel stays, critical home repairs, and utilities. So power bills, heating assistance. And then the 4th allowable category of use was just other McKinney-Vento allowable uses. So anything that would be authorized under McKinney-Vento statute for schools to support with. So this funding was a pilot program that was for 2 years, and it was available on grants from me. And so schools could spend up to $750 per student to support any of those 4 allowable categories of youth. The state of the program right now is that we offered a reallocation to the schools that participated for last school year, which was the fiscal year 2025. Within that application, if schools had wrote on grants for me that they were accepting the funding that the Maine Department of Education had allocated to them, they would have received an additional reallocation for this school in that grants for me application. And that was just based on consolidated funds that were not used or drawn down by schools in the first 2 years of that pilot program. If you are an SAU that is participating in preventing student homelessness, you did have a reallocation that went out this summer that is available on grants for me. And what we had originally put out as the invoicing timeline for the pilot, closing out the pilot program portion of this preventing student homelessness program, was all expenses needing to be done by the end of the calendar year of 2025, with the final invoices submitted by March 31st. We have revised that expenditure timeline just because we are providing additional funds for to be used this school year in that fiscal year 25 application. And the final expenses need to be made by 3/31/26, and those final invoices for preventing student homelessness by 5/1. So we just are giving a little bit more time to draw down the end of those funds because we need to close out by the end of this fiscal year. And as for continuation, so like I was saying, this was a pilot program initiated by the Maine legislature to work on prevention and also to provide additional funding to support McKinney-Vento programming, particularly because there was the ending of the American Rescue Plan Homeless Children and Youth Dedicated Fund. What we saw during the most recent legislative session is that this program was made permanent into a preventing student homelessness fund. And we also saw it get cut from a continuation of 1.5 million a year to 125,000. So that puts us in a situation where we don't have a lot of funding available, and we're going to provide an update from the Maine Department of Education of how we're going to distribute that funding to schools so that they have the opportunity to receive some funding. But like I said, that's a 1.5 million to $125,000 that we're going to have to figure out a way to distribute. So I will be in touch once we have a plan, because this was just passed in the most recent legislative session, and it hasn't even become law yet because of that 90-day window from when the session ends. And I'm going to look at the chat because I saw some questions come up. So yes, Megan, so there is a way so you can certainly ask your business office if you have preventing student homelessness funds. And I can also just let you know if that application is available. And it was either because schools never completed a funding application, or they explicitly told the Maine Department of Education they didn't want to receive the funds. With funding and what schools can offer. Okay, just want to make sure I was reading through the chat. Schools offer the transportation to school of origin, which is actually one of the statutory pieces of McKinney-Vento. And what that means is if there is a loss of housing that puts a student outside of the catchment area of your SAU or your school, they have the right to continue in the school of origin where they were last regularly attending, if it's in the best interest of the students, and if so, to have that transportation to the school of origin arranged. And that's a collaborative effort between where that student is residing and the school in which they were attending. Immediate enrollment without required documents is another statutory piece of this. And that does not mean that students that are McKinney-Vento eligible are not are exempt from providing required documents. It just means that we get students through the door, we get them attending school, and then the McKinney-Vento liaison and the team that's supporting them is going to work with that family to get any of those required documents. So whether that's vaccination records or birth certificates, things like that, the school would be supporting in while the student is starting to attend and have some sense of stability. School supplies, clothing, hygiene items, making sure that we're supporting with that FAFSA and post-secondary transition for high school students, referring out also to other agencies. So building those community partnerships to make sure that there are referral systems in place for these students that are identified and needing some additional support outside of what the school might be able to offer at that time. Those early childhood education referrals. And one of the pieces about McKinney-Vento that is very helpful, that is rare in federal language, is that it's explicit that schools can provide other extraordinary or emergency assistance needed. So that gives some wiggle room for what supports might be available or could be provided to remove a barrier to that student being able to participate in school and all of the school activities. And when we identify students, we document that, and once they're identified, they carry that status for the entire academic year. And so we operate McKinney-Vento July 1 to June 30th. So if a student is identified in November of that year because they have a loss of housing, they would be eligible to continue. And this is an important reference point for when we're talking about time frame. So if you had a student that, for example, has that loss of housing in November, they become doubled up with a family friend a couple of towns over. They really want to continue at that school of origin where they were going to, and you let the other school district that they're currently residing in know that, hey, it's in the best interest of these students to stay at the school of origin. Can we work together on transportation? That transportation is arranged. They're continuing to go to the school of origin, and then that family is able to secure a lease in another town. That town is not where the school of origin is, and they still would have the right to, if it's in their best interest, finish the school year in the school of origin. But because they've now secured permanent housing and they have a formal lease, the expectation for that following school year is that they enroll in that new school community, because that's where their new permanent address is. The alternative would be pursuing that superintendent's agreement, but if they've secured that permanent housing, then they would not be eligible for McKinney-Vento again. Sometimes we do see families that are continuing to experience homelessness over the summer months, and they're eligible again the following school year, and they continue to exist outside, or they continue to reside outside of the SAU of Origin's catchment area. It's going to be up to the McKinney-Vento liaison of the school of origin, working with the family themselves and the school district that they are residing in, to make a best interest determination that is student-centered on whether they should continue to go to the school that they were at last school year as the school of origin, or if they should immediately enroll in that new school of residence for the start of the school year, still identified as a McKinney-Vento student. And school of origin, this is the McKinney-Vento statutory language. So the school of origin means the school that a child or youth attended when permanently housed, or the school in which the child or youth was last enrolled, including that preschool. School of residence is really where the student is residing at night and is involved in the best interest determinations for the students. And just to note that when we talk about enrollment, it's defined in law as attending classes and participating fully in school activities. So a question that comes up quite a bit is those students that are maybe bouncing around quite a bit, and they've completed paperwork in several school communities because they might have been staying for a couple of days in that school community. They have that loss of housing, they go to a new community, and they have essentially a paper trail of enrollments, but they never actually walk through those school doors, or they go for one day before they have another unexpected loss of housing and they're in a new school community. We're really looking at enrollment as attending classes and participating fully in school activities. So it's not necessarily where they last completed paperwork. The school of origins where they were last regularly attending. Best interest determinations, and again, this is our federal language. We really default to keeping kids in the school of origin for school stability. We know that frequent school transitions have adverse effects on students' educational outcomes and well-being, but we try to keep students in the school of origin to the extent that it's feasible, right? And if there's a best interest determination where a school is supporting a student and a family, and they're saying, you know what, it really is not in the best interest to have this student go 2 hours on a van each day to this other school where they were last attending, and we think it's in the best interest for them to enroll in the school of residence, and the family still disagrees with that, the most important thing for McKinney-Vento liaisons to be aware of is just providing that written notice of a best interest determination that the family might not agree with. So you want to make sure you're providing a written notice about a best interest determination for a family that might be in disagreement. And then within that written notice, you give them the right to dispute that decision. So that's really important just procedurally, to make sure that you have documentation of best interest determinations and why decisions are made, and remembering that they are those student-centered decisions of what is in the best interest of a student in their educational placement. And we look at in best interest determinations, there are lots of different factors that we can look at. Particularly, we're looking at the age, the time of the school year, the distance of the commute. Maybe there's special education services are also a consideration to what the parent, or in the case of an unaccompanied homeless youth, what they would like, and the anticipated length of stay of wherever they are. So just thinking about all of the different aspects that might be impacting a student's education, taking all of those into consideration when making a best interest determination on whether a student should continue to go to the school of origin with that transportation, or immediately enroll in the school of residence with that documentation. And Megan, there's no worries about any of the questions. They're really important, and I want to make sure that people have their questions answered. Is there a state form for that documentation? So we have sample bid form that I can share out with this email that will go out with the slides, so that you have it for reference. And then we do see schools that create their own, and it just is making sure that you're documenting why you're making a decision for a student, that making sure that the family has the right to dispute, and that the best interest determination is documented with all of those points of why it's in the best interest for them to enroll in the school of residence. And once the best interest determination for the student remaining in the school of origin is made, transportation comes into play. So transportation is a statutory right of students that are identified as McKinney-Vento. And when they're living outside of the SAU's catchment area, that's when there needs to be communication between the two school communities, right? So oftentimes that's going to look like the McKinney-Vento liaison making contact with the other McKinney-Vento liaison where that student is residing, and letting them know that, hey, we have a student living with you. Maybe it's a very clear best interest determination. We're just working on getting that transportation set up. And that the transportation piece is the shared responsibility of the SAU, the other school district that they're residing in, and the school district that they're going back. So the statute is explicit in saying that that's the shared responsibility. And really, if there's not an agreed upon method of getting that student back and forth, that's when the cost is split 50-50. Something that we really want to avoid that sometimes occurs is a school district getting a bill at the end of the school year for a student for half the transportation costs accrued by a school of origin for a student that the school of residence had no idea even existed in their school catchment area because they were laying their head at night. So even if you have a very clear best interest determination where transportation is going to be provided, maybe you already have a van or bus going out in that direction that student is able to get on, it is always best practice to make sure that you are making contact with the McKinney-Vento liaison in the other school community to let them know that you have a McKinney-Vento student, they're one of ours, they're living there, and then discussing that transportation and just giving them the heads up, because we definitely don't want to see those surprises at the end of the school year, because that shared cost is really only second to if there's not an agreed upon responsibility and agreed upon method, right? And then for disputes, disputes occur over eligibility or best interest determinations. And so if a family feels like they're enrolling in a school and they are denied enrollment because the school does not believe that they are McKinney-Vento eligible, they need to be provided that written notice of why the school believes that they are not eligible for McKinney-Vento. Or if there's a best interest determination that's made after eligibility is determined for that student to, for example, continue going to the school of origin, or to enroll in the school of residence, then the written notice needs to be provided, and that student has to have, or student unaccompanied homeless youth, or the family has to have that right to dispute that decision. And schools have local dispute procedures. Typically, we might see that be the McKinney-Vento liaison, and then if that decision is made and it's disputed at the local level and the superintendent is weighing in, depending on your local dispute policies and procedures, that's when the Maine Department of Education would look at a formal dispute. And that's where we reference that chapter 14 and the rules within that provide some of that procedure for state level disputes. And during a dispute, and for the state of Maine, so once the Maine Department of Education receives a formal dispute, the department has 10 business days to provide a formal response and resolution. But during that time of a formal dispute being filed with the Maine Department of Education, that's where the student has the right to continue where they're seeking enrollment or where they believe is in the best interest of that individual student. And providing that written notice. And I will send out in this follow-up with these slides, the formal dispute resolution paperwork too, so that you have it available. Any questions about best interest determinations, disputes, written notices, any of those pieces? All right. I did want to just clarify, because it does come up quite a bit as a question to the Maine Department of Education for students that go and attend an SPPS, meaning a special purpose private school. For those students that are attending an SPPS through special education services and IEP decisions, it's really we would think about that as an SAU of origin when making best interest determinations for students, because the SAU that is making the overseeing the IEP placement of that student is the fiscally responsible. They're overseeing the educational decisions, and they are the SAU of origin. So if that student becomes McKinney-Vento eligible, the McKinney-Vento liaison from the sending SAU would be involved in helping making that best interest determination. So that's just something to keep in mind on those more complicated special education cases that might come up. And this is just a helpful flow chart for thinking about McKinney-Vento eligibility, and when we think about the special education services, where the student will go and who's responsible for the provision of a free appropriate public education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So just reviewing the 10, so for McKinney-Vento liaisons, this is we've provided some context for McKinney-Vento and the range of supports that are available and what to be considering when supporting students. There's 10 statutory duties of the McKinney-Vento liaison, and this really goes back to as we talk about the statutory duties, keeping in mind that this is a team effort, and that you're going to need to be working and collaborating with a lot of different people in the school to make sure that these things are being met from your school community. So the first one would be that homeless children and youth are identified by school personnel through outreach and coordination with entities and agencies. So a lot of it's being aware of what your community-based organizations and community resources are, and are they able to make referrals into your school for families they might be working with that would be eligible for McKinney-Vento? Is there an open line of communication? And we also look at the McKinney-Vento screener form in school enrollment packets, right? So that could be like a first way of identifying students, of just having a screener form in all school enrollments that outlines some of the housing situations that a student may be living in, and making it so that they can it can be an indicator that that might be a student that needs to have a further conversation with the family or student themselves about what's going on to see if they're eligible for McKinney-Vento. This is also particularly important for students that are enrolling mid-school year. So they might be coming from another school community. They might not even be aware that they could potentially qualify for McKinney-Vento, could potentially qualify to go back to that school of origin. So being able to have an enrollment screener that can help indicate students that might be eligible. Homeless children and youth are enrolled and have full and equal opportunity to succeed in school. Really coordinating with the registrar's office, the people that are receiving these school enrollments, and making sure that they're aware of McKinney-Vento and what to maybe look for and have in discussion with families as they're looking through those enrollment paperwork. Homeless children and youth receive educational services for which they are eligible, including Head Start, early intervention, and preschool programs administered by the district and school. And that goes back to that early childhood piece, being aware of how to make a referral to Child Development Services, and specifically Jackie and Brooke from CDS that could support you with some of those early childhood pieces. Homeless families, children, and youth receive referrals to health, dental, mental health, housing, substance abuse, and other appropriate services. We have, sample check-in forms that could be used. So as you're working with a good practice for McKinney-Vento liaisons is you have, a list of all the students that are eligible for McKinney-Vento in your school community, and then doing an annual check-in, whether it's the liaison themselves or the school social workers or guidance team that or school counselor team that might be working with the students, and going through a check-in to see if they need any specific supports that could be a barrier right now to their education. So potentially looking at those referrals to external agencies, knowing that, again, it's not all on schools to figure out every aspect of barriers, but it's about making sure that appropriate referrals are going out to agencies that can also support while the school is making sure that that student can get to school each day and has the right to fully participate in school activities. Parents and guardians are informed of the educational and related opportunities available to their children and are provided with meaningful opportunities to participate. So this can also we see a lot of like outreach flyers that are available, or family engagement nights that have McKinney-Vento incorporated so that families have the opportunity to learn about potential eligibility. But certainly postings on bulletin boards and having opportunities to meet with families and talk about potential eligibility as well. And this is also speaks to the public notices. So this is the public notices of homeless students' rights is in locations frequented by parents and guardians. We also see this happen like working with like community-based organizations where you could provide flyers too, so that they're able to give those to families and students that they're working with directly, so they know how to get in touch with a McKinney-Vento liaison. And we have helpful posters that you can print from the Maine DOE McKinney-Vento website that have that QR code, that link to the contact lookup for McKinney-Vento liaisons. That 7 would be the enrollment disputes are mediated. So just being aware of like what your local policy is for disputes as they relate to McKinney-Vento, and making sure that you are providing written notices for eligibility and best interest determinations where there might be conflict with the family or unaccompanied homeless youth. Number 8, parents, guardians, and unaccompanied youth are informed of and assisted in accessing transportation services, including transportation to the school of origin. So making sure that transportation is provided. School personnel are provided McKinney-Vento services and receive professional development and other support. So if you have professional development days and you wanted to use, for example, like I'm happy to share some of my McKinney-Vento slides with you so that you could use them when talking to school staff that are working directly with families that may be eligible for McKinney-Vento and you wanted to provide some of that professional development internally for your team, you're welcome to reach out to me and I'm happy to share those slides, or you can pull them from the slides that I'm going to share out today so that you have them. Another helpful resource to just be aware of is Schoolhouse Connection. They're our national advocacy partner and they do a lot of work for liaisons and provide a tremendous amount of technical assistance to local school communities as well as myself as it relates to McKinney-Vento. And they have a whole toolkit for liaisons available, so you could certainly use some of their resources as well. And oftentimes when I'm sharing sample forms, they are things that Schoolhouse Connection has designed for states and local communities. And then number 10 is just the speaking specifically to unaccompanied youth. So making sure that unaccompanied homeless youth are able to enroll themselves in school and they have the opportunities to meet the same challenging academic standards as other children and youth. And the other piece is that independent student status for the FAFSA. So building those bridges to higher education. It's always helpful. So in thinking about like removing barriers for enrollment, an activity that we've done with liaisons in the past is just consider visiting your local school's website and completing enrollment as a family that may be experiencing housing instability and eligible. Are they able to find contact information for McKinney-Vento and talking about eligibility? So is that stuff that is a notice that's published on your school website? And then also thinking about if you are an unaccompanied homeless youth going in to complete that school paperwork or enrollment paperwork, are you able to enroll without having a legal guardian involved in that online enrollment? So just thinking about some of those barriers that might present to enrollment or identification without some of those public notices available online. Consider making the point of contact system too. If you have multiple schools in your school community, it's a lot for a McKinney-Vento liaison. It's unrealistic for a McKinney-Vento liaison to know what's going on in every student's life in a school community. So potentially looking at having a designated point of contact in each school that is responsible for making some of those postings in the school community, and also as the central point of contact for any referrals from school staff that are coming in to be able to make that identification as well. So it can be the McKinney-Vento liaison and their designees. And then step-by-step for liaison, just making sure you're identifying. So first there's that eligibility determination. Then if they're outside of that school catchment area, making a best interest determination for that student. Then we provide some of those supports that are available, potential referrals. And then next year, after that, July 1st, reassessing eligibility and best interest determinations. These are all the sample forms that will be hyperlinked in the slides for you to use. Talking about building a point of contact system. This is a sample communication system from another local school system that was willing to share. And this is just what they share with school staff about how to get in contact with a situation that may be McKinney-Vento eligible. So it's just a sample of how another school community in Maine provides this information to other school staff about identifying students and providing appropriate supports. If your school is monitored for McKinney-Vento, we do desk audits of monitoring every few years, or desk audits of McKinney-Vento compliance every few years. And really, if you receive a letter saying that you're being monitored for McKinney-Vento, we're just looking for making sure that your staff is aware. These are just really the framework for what the Maine Department of Education would be looking for in a monitoring ask of a school department. So just looking at local policies and procedures, how outreach is made to schools, making sure that all of those things are in compliance with the federal law. We have the McKinney, so professional learning opportunities throughout this school year is the McKinney-Vento and foster care office hours. We're going to have, if you haven't participated in the past, we have in-person regional meetings that are McKinney-Vento focused. They're 2.5-hour sessions. We go all across the state. We do have a virtual option, and we certainly encourage people to come in person as much as possible, just because it's a great learning opportunity, a great opportunity to meet local liaisons and community providers. But we're scheduling those right now for November, so that will be, registration will go out. I will send them out to the McKinney-Vento listserv, and they will also go out in the McKinney-Vento newsletter. Certainly signing up for Schoolhouse Connections newsletter for webinars is really helpful, as well as National Center for Homeless Education and the briefs that they have available for guidance. Resource hubs for just knowing what is available in Maine specifically. The Department of Education 11 credit diploma is something I always share with liaisons. So if you're working with a student who is in high school, they may be a junior or senior, and they are very credit deficient because they've had a lot of instability, but they are still determined to get that diploma, they would likely be eligible for the Maine Department of Education 11 credit diploma that can be applied for through the Maine Department of Education on behalf of the student. It's not for students that want to graduate early. It's for those that are making progress and they've had significant disruption. One of the eligible situations that would qualify a student for an 11 credit diploma is McKinney-Vento status during their high school career. And Jason Libby is the contact for that if you are interested in learning more. Working with young people specifically, and when we work to empower students, we understand that they are not the leaders of tomorrow, but that they are already leaders with their voices that need to be heard. To create equity-centered, trauma-informed schools, our students are our most impactful partners. So just considering the needs of young people that are actively experiencing these situations as well, to understand what barriers are potentially present in a school to get them to fully participate in school or show up daily. And this is just a nice note from one of our school visits that we did about what home means to you. And with that, I have the McKinney-Vento newsletter. Sign up if you haven't signed up for it. That's where we do monthly updates about resources that are potential webinars and other resources, frequently asked questions that are coming in. Evaluation for contact hours, I'm going to send a follow-up email to, so you have these links available. And this is my contact information. I know I just talked at you for a long time, but I wanted to make sure that all of this information did get covered in this session, and certainly available. I'm going to stop the recording now, but I really just appreciate everyone sticking with me and listening to this McKinney-Vento overview, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in schools and making this all happen. So I'm going to stop the recording, but certainly we'll stay on if anyone has any specific questions or cases that they'd like to discuss.